What happens when a beloved music legend sits down for what should be a friendly chat on daytime television, only to face an unprovoked ambush from a host who thinks she can say whatever she wants? In just 45 seconds, one comment from Denise Welch would turn a simple interview into the most explosive moment in Loose Women history. A meltdown so shocking that the guest would storm off set, leaving the entire panel speechless and the studio audience gasping in disbelief. Cliff Richard walked onto the Loose Women set that afternoon, expecting a pleasant conversation about his latest album, his upcoming tour, and perhaps a few lighthearted questions about his decades-long career. The audience applauded warmly as he made his way to the famous panel desk, shaking hands with each of the hosts. Denise Welch sat at the center, flanked by Kay Adams, Nadia Sawalha, and Jane Moore. The energy in the studio felt bright and welcoming, the kind of atmosphere Cliff had experienced countless times throughout his illustrious career. "Welcome, welcome," Denise said, her smile wide as Cliff settled into his seat. "Lovely to have you here. We're all massive fans, aren't we, ladies?" The other panelists nodded enthusiastically. Kay Adams leaned forward, already prepared with her first question. "So Cliff, tell us about the new album. What can fans expect?" Cliff's face lit up as he began to speak about his music, the passion evident in his voice. "Well, it's been a real labor of love, this one. I've gone back to my roots in some ways, but also tried to bring something fresh. The fans have been so supportive over the years, and I really wanted to give them something special." Nadia Sawalha jumped in next, her tone warm and genuine. "You've been in this business for so long, and you still have that same energy. What's your secret?" "I just love what I do," Cliff responded with a humble smile. "Music has always been my life, and connecting with people through songs, that's what keeps me going. I feel incredibly blessed to still be able to do this." The conversation flowed smoothly for the first few minutes. Jane Moore asked about his touring schedule, and Cliff shared a funny story about a recent show where the sound system had failed, and he'd ended up performing acoustically for the entire audience. Everyone laughed, the mood light and friendly. But then Denise Welch shifted in her seat, and something in her expression changed. Her smile took on a sharper edge, and she leaned forward with a look that made the other panelists exchange quick glances. "Can I just say something, Cliff?" Denise interrupted, her voice cutting through Nadia's follow-up question about his favorite performance venues. "Of course," Cliff said, turning to face her politely. "I think it's interesting that you sit here talking about your music and your tours and your fans, but you never really address the elephant in the room, do you?" Denise's tone had completely shifted, the warmth from moments earlier replaced with something cold and confrontational. The studio audience fell silent. Kay Adams looked visibly uncomfortable, sitting back in her chair. Jane Moore's eyes widened, and Nadia Sawalha looked between Denise and Cliff with clear concern on her face. Cliff's brow furrowed slightly. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean," Denise pressed on, her voice rising slightly. "You come on shows like this, you promote your albums, you smile for the cameras, but you act like nothing ever happened, like we're all just supposed to forget and move on." "Denise," Kay tried to interject, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe we should—" "No, Kay, I'm sorry, but somebody needs to say it," Denise snapped, barely glancing at her fellow panelist. She turned back to Cliff, her eyes fixed on him. "You want to talk about your career, your legacy, but what about accountability? What about addressing the things that people actually want to know about?" Cliff remained remarkably composed, though his discomfort was becoming increasingly visible. "Denise, I came here today to talk about my music. I understood that's what this interview was about. If you have specific questions, perhaps you could ask them directly, rather than speaking in riddles." "Fine, I'll be direct then," Denise shot back, her voice dripping with condescension. "How do you expect people to just separate the art from the artist when there are questions that have never been properly answered? How do you sleep at night, knowing that there are people out there who feel they never got closure? The other three panelists looked mortified. Nadia Sawalha reached out, placing her hand on Denise's arm. Denise, this isn't fair. Cliff was cleared. This was all investigated thoroughly, and... Oh, so we're not allowed to ask questions now? Denise interrupted again, shaking off Nadia's hand. We're just supposed to sit here and fawn over him because he's had some hit records? Jane Moore spoke up, her voice steady but clearly frustrated. That's not what anyone is saying, but ambushing a guest with unfounded accusations isn't journalism, Denise. It's cruel. Cruel? Denise laughed, but there was no humor in it. What's cruel is acting like nothing happened. What's cruel is expecting everyone to just smile and nod and buy the albums and go to the concerts without asking any difficult questions. Cliff's jaw tightened, but he maintained his dignity. Denise, I have been through one of the most difficult periods of my life. I was investigated, my name was dragged through the mud, my privacy was violated in the most horrific ways. And at the end of it all, I was completely exonerated. Completely. There were no charges. No evidence. Nothing. Because there was nothing to find. That's what they all say, isn't it? Denise muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. The audience gasped audibly. Kay Adams looked absolutely shocked, her mouth falling open. Denise, that is completely out of line. Is it, though? Denise challenged, now fully committed to her confrontational stance. Are we really going to sit here and pretend that just because someone wasn't charged, that means everything is fine? That we should all just forget about it and move on? Cliff's voice remained calm, but there was a tremor of anger beneath it now. What exactly are you suggesting, Denise? Because it sounds very much like you're making accusations that have no basis in fact whatsoever. I was investigated by the police, extensively. My home was raided. My life was turned upside down, and they found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? Denise replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Nadia Sawalha had heard enough. Denise, stop. Just stop. This is disgraceful. Cliff came here as a guest, and you're treating him like he's on trial. This isn't what this show is supposed to be about. Maybe it should be, Denise countered. Maybe instead of just giving celebrities a platform to sell their products, we should be holding them accountable. Accountable for what? Jane Moore demanded, her voice raised now. He was cleared. Denise, do you understand what that means? It means the allegations were investigated and found to be without merit. You're essentially saying you don't trust the justice system, and that's your right. Well, but you don't get to use this platform to launch personal attacks on someone who has done nothing wrong. Cliff sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, but his face had gone pale. The toll of the conversation was clearly wearing on him. Denise wasn't backing down. I'm not launching a personal attack. I'm simply saying that the public has a right to ask questions, and celebrities shouldn't be immune from scrutiny just because they're famous or because they've been around for a long time. Scrutiny? Cliff finally spoke again, his voice tight with emotion. Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like a public humiliation. I agreed to come on this show to talk about my music, my passion, the thing that has defined my entire life. Instead, that you've ambushed me with baseless insinuations and treated me like I'm guilty of something when I have been proven innocent. Proven innocent is not the same as being innocent, Denise said, and the words hung in the air like poison. The other three panelists erupted simultaneously. Kay Adams was shaking her head in disbelief. I cannot believe you just said that. I genuinely cannot believe you just said that on live television. That is absolutely disgusting, Jane Moore added, her face flushed with anger. You should be ashamed of yourself, Denise. Nadia Sawalha looked close to tears. Cliff, I am so sorry. This is not okay. None of this is okay. But Cliff had already begun to remove his microphone. His hands were steady, despite the clear emotion in his eyes. I have spent years rebuilding my life after having it torn apart by false allegations. I have endured public humiliation, invasion of privacy, and the loss of my reputation, all for something I did not do. I came here today in good faith, believing this would be a respectful conversation. Instead, I've been subjected to a trial by television from someone who clearly made up her mind long before I walked through that door. "Oh, don't play the victim," Denise said dismissively, waving her hand. "You're a rich, famous man with all the resources in the world. I think you'll survive a few tough questions." Cliff stood up from his chair, his microphone now removed and placed carefully on the desk in front of him. "Tough questions are one thing, Denise. Character assassination is another. And what you've done here today is shameful. You've used your platform not to inform or to enlighten, but to bully and to condemn someone based on nothing more than your own personal biases." Kay Adams stood up as well, reaching out to Cliff. "Please, Cliff, don't go. Denise doesn't speak for all of us. We are mortified by what's happened here." "I appreciate that, Kay. I really do," Cliff said, his voice softening slightly. "But I cannot sit here and be treated this way. I have been through enough. I don't need to subject myself to this." Denise rolled her eyes. "Oh, here we go. Running away when things get uncomfortable. How predictable." Jane Moore slammed her hand down on the desk, the sound echoing through the studio. "Shut up, Denise. Just shut up. You've done enough damage already." The audience was completely silent now, stunned by what they were witnessing. Some looked sympathetic toward Cliff, others simply shocked by the entire confrontation. Nadia Sawalha was crying now, trying to apologize to Cliff even as he began to walk away from the panel. "Cliff, please, we're so sorry. This isn't what we wanted. This isn't who we are." Cliff paused, turning back to face the panel one last time. His eyes were glistening, but he held his head high. "I have always believed in treating people with kindness and respect, even when they don't deserve it. But I will not stand here and allow someone to imply that I am guilty of crimes I did not commit, that I was cleared of after a thorough investigation. I have my dignity, and I won't let anyone take that from me. Not anymore." "Fine, leave then," Denise said, crossing her arms defiantly. But don't expect everyone to just forget and act like everything is fine just because you say so." Cliff looked at her, his expression a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "I don't expect anything from you, Denise, but I do pity you, because you clearly have so much anger and bitterness inside you that you're willing to hurt someone who has done nothing to you, just to make yourself feel powerful. That's not strength. That's cruelty. And I hope someday you realize that." With those final words, Cliff Richard turned and walked off the set. The cameras followed him briefly as he exited through the studio doors, his posture upright and dignified despite the obvious emotional toll the confrontation had taken. Back at the panel, chaos ensued. Kay Adams had her head in her hands, clearly distressed. Jane Moore was glaring at Denise with undisguised anger. Nadia Sawalha was wiping tears from her eyes, still visibly upset. "I hope you're happy," Jane said to Denise, her voice cold. "You just humiliated a man who has been through hell and come out the other side. A man who was proven innocent. And you did it for what? Ratings? To make yourself look edgy and controversial?" "I asked legitimate questions," Denise defended herself, though her voice lacked the confidence it had moments before. "Questions that people want answered." "No, you didn't," Kay countered, looking up at her. "You made accusations. You insinuated guilt where there is none. You ambushed a guest who came here in good faith. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. It's just mean." Nadia nodded in agreement, her voice shaky. "He trusted us. And you betrayed that trust. Do you have any idea how damaging this is? Not just to him, but to us as a show, to our credibility." Denise looked around at her fellow panelists, and for the first time, she seemed uncertain. "I was just trying to—" "To what?" Jane interrupted. "To destroy someone who's already been through enough? Mission accomplished, Denise. I hope it was worth it. The studio audience remained quiet, the atmosphere heavy with discomfort and tension. Producers were rushing around backstage, trying to figure out how to salvage the remainder of the show. The commercial break music began to play, a jarring contrast to the serious and somber mood that had descended over the entire production. As the cameras cut away, the four panelists sat in uncomfortable silence. Denise stared down at the desk, her arms still crossed defensively. The other three refused to look at her, each processing what had just happened in their own way. Kay was the first to speak during the break, her voice barely above a whisper. That was one of the worst things I've ever witnessed on this show, and I've been here a long time. He didn't deserve that, Nadia said, her voice thick with emotion. He really didn't deserve that. Jane looked directly at Denise. You need to apologize. On air. When we come back, you need to apologize for what you just did. I'm not apologizing for asking questions, Denise replied, but her voice wavered. Then you're even more deluded than I thought, Jane shot back. Those weren't questions, Denise. That was a witch hunt. And you were judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. Kay shook her head sadly. We invited him here. We promised him a safe space to talk about his work, his music, the things he loves. And instead, he walked into an ambush. How do you think that makes us look? How do you think that makes anyone feel safe coming on this show in the future? Nadia wiped her eyes again. I've never been so embarrassed in my entire career. Never. Denise opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For someone who had been so vocal and confident during the confrontation, she now seemed at a loss for what to say. You know what the worst part is? Jane continued, her anger still simmering beneath the surface. He handled it with more grace and dignity than you could ever hope to possess. Even when you were attacking him, even when you were implying the most horrible things, he remained calm and composed. He defended himself without stooping to your level. And then he left, because he has enough self-respect to not sit there and take your abuse. It wasn't abuse, Denise muttered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Yes, it was, Kay said firmly. It absolutely was. You used your position, your platform, to go after someone who was vulnerable, someone who has already suffered immensely. And you did it knowing full well that he couldn't really fight back without looking defensive. You backed him into a corner, and when he chose to leave rather than engage with your vitriol, you mocked him for that too. The floor manager approached the panel, looking stressed and anxious. We're back in 2 minutes. What are we doing? The four women looked at each other, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Miss Kay took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. We're going to address what just happened. We're going to make it clear that Denise's behavior was not representative of this show or its values. And then we're going to try to move forward as best we can. Denise shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. The makeup artist rushed over to touch up the panelists' faces, though the tension was still palpable. Nadia's eyes were red from crying, and no amount of powder could hide that. As the countdown began, the four women composed themselves as best they could. The cameras came back on, and Kay Adams took the lead, her voice serious and measured. Before we continue with the show, we need to address what just happened. Our guest, Cliff Richard, has left the studio following a very difficult and confrontational exchange. And I want to make it absolutely clear that the way that conversation unfolded was not okay. Jane jumped in immediately, her support for Kay's statement evident. Cliff Richard came here to talk about his music, and instead he was subjected to unfounded accusations and personal attacks. That should never have happened, and we are deeply sorry. Nadia nodded, still visibly emotional. Cliff has been nothing but gracious throughout his career, and he deserved so much better than what he received today. We failed him as hosts, and for that, I am truly sorry. All eyes turned to Denise, waiting for her to add her own apology. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before, but still lacking genuine remorse. "I believe in asking difficult questions," she said slowly. "But perhaps today was not the right time or place for that particular conversation." It was barely an acknowledgement, let alone an apology, and the other three panelists' expressions made that clear. But before anyone could press her further, Kay moved the show along, desperate to salvage what was left of the episode. The remainder of the show felt hollow and forced. The chemistry between the panelists was gone, replaced by awkward silences and stilted conversation. The audience seemed subdued, the energy in the studio completely different from the warm atmosphere that had existed when Cliff Richard first walked on set. During the next commercial break, Jane Moore stood up from her seat. "I can't do this anymore today. I'm sorry, but I just can't sit here and pretend everything is fine." "Jane, please," Kay pleaded. "We only have one more segment." "Then do it without me," Jane replied, already removing her microphone. "I need some air. I need to process what just happened. Because right now, I'm so angry and so ashamed that I can't even think straight." Nadia looked like she wanted to leave too, but she stayed in her seat, loyal to the show even in the midst of the chaos. Kay put on a brave face, but the strain was evident in every line of her expression. When the cameras came back on for the final segment, Jane's empty chair sat as a stark reminder of the disaster that had unfolded. Kay, Nadia, and Denise tried to discuss the remaining topics on their rundown, but it was clear that no one's heart was in it anymore. The show ended with a subdued goodbye from the panelists, yet none of them able to muster the usual enthusiasm and warmth that typically closed each episode. As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, Denise stood up quickly and left the set without a word to anyone. Kay and Nadia remained sitting, both looking exhausted and emotionally drained. "What just happened?" Nadia asked quietly, though the question was rhetorical. They both knew exactly what had happened. They had just witnessed a complete breakdown of everything the show was supposed to represent. "I don't know how we come back from this," Kay admitted, her voice heavy with worry. "I really don't know." Behind the scenes, the production team was already in crisis mode. Phone calls were being made, statements were being drafted, and damage control was in full swing. But the damage had been done. Broadcast live for the entire nation to see. In a quiet corner of the studio, away from the chaos, one of the producers stood with their head in their hands, muttering to themselves, "How did this happen? How did we let this happen?" The answer was complex, a combination of unchecked egos, poor judgment, and a fundamental failure to protect a guest who had come to the show in good faith. But the simplest answer was also the truest one. It happened because one person decided that their personal opinions and desire for controversy were more important than basic human decency and respect. And in those 45 seconds, when Denise Welch first shifted the tone of the interview from friendly to confrontational, she set in motion a chain of events that would result in one of the most shocking and disgraceful moments in daytime television history. A moment that would be remembered not for any groundbreaking journalism or important conversation, but for the cruel and unjust treatment of a man who had already suffered more than most people could imagine. Cliff Richard's dignified exit from that studio stood in stark contrast to the behavior he had been subjected to. While Denise Welch had tried to paint herself as some kind of fearless truth-teller, asking the tough questions that needed to be asked, what she had actually revealed was her own lack of empathy, her own willingness to hurt someone for the sake of creating drama. The silence that filled the studio after Cliff left spoke volumes. It was the silence of regret, of shame, and of collective realization that something terribly wrong had just occurred. The other panelists knew it. The audience knew it. Even some of the crew members had tears in their eyes as they watched a beloved entertainer walk away with his head held high despite being treated so poorly. What should have been a celebration of a legendary career, a chance for fans to hear about new music and upcoming tours, had instead become a nightmare. An ambush disguised as an interview. An attack disguised as accountability. And through it all, Cliff Richard maintained his composure, his grace, and his dignity. He defended himself without becoming aggressive. He expressed his hurt without becoming cruel. He called out the injustice without becoming bitter. And when it became clear that the conversation was not going to improve, he made the choice to remove himself from the situation rather than continue to subject himself to abuse. That decision, that moment when he stood up and removed his microphone, was powerful in its simplicity. It was a man saying, "Enough. I have been through enough. I have suffered enough, and I will not allow this to continue." Denise Welch had expected him to sit there and take it, to defend himself endlessly against her insinuations, to give her the confrontational television moment she was clearly seeking. But Cliff refused to play that game. He refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break down or lash out. Instead, he simply left, taking his dignity with him and leaving her looking exactly like what she was in that moment, which was a bully who had gone too far. The other panelists scrambling to apologize, and to distance themselves from Denise's behavior, only highlighted how out of line she had been. Their genuine distress and embarrassment stood in sharp contrast to her defiant attitude, her refusal to acknowledge that she had done anything wrong. As the studio emptied out after the show, the atmosphere was somber and tense. People spoke in hushed tones, many still in shock over what they had witnessed. The usual post-show chatter and laughter was absent, replaced by serious conversations about what had happened and what it meant for the future of the program. Somewhere outside the studio, Cliff Richard was likely processing the events of the afternoon, surrounded by people who cared about him and supported him. He had walked into that studio as a guest, an invited visitor, who was supposed to be treated with respect and courtesy. He had left as a victim of an unprovoked attack, his only crime being that he accepted an invitation to appear on the show. The contrast could not have been more stark. On one side, a man with decades of success, beloved by millions, who had survived false accusations and emerged with his integrity intact. On the other, a talk show host who had used her platform not to enlighten or entertain, but to wound and to judge. And in the end, it was clear who had truly won that confrontation. Not through aggression or anger, but through grace under pressure. Not by fighting back with the same cruelty that had been directed at him, but by simply refusing to accept treatment that was beneath his dignity. Cliff Richard's exit from that Loose Women set was not a retreat or a defeat. It was a statement. A declaration that some things are more important than ratings or controversy or the approval of people who have already made up their minds, regardless of facts or evidence. It was a reminder that kindness matters, that truth matters, that how we treat people matters. And it was a powerful rebuke to anyone who thinks that fame or position or a television platform gives them the right to tear someone down without consequence. The 45 seconds that changed everything had revealed the true character of everyone involved. And while Denise Welch may have thought she was being brave or bold or uncompromising in her questioning, what she actually demonstrated was something far less admirable. She showed that, given the choice between kindness and cruelty, between understanding and judgment, between building someone up and tearing them down, she would choose the latter every single time. And that choice, made in full view of the cameras and the audience and her fellow panelists, told the world everything they needed to know about who she really was when the spotlight was on and the microphones were live. Meanwhile, Cliff Richard had shown who he was too. A man who had been tested beyond measure, who had faced his worst nightmare and come out the other side, who still believed in dignity and respect even when others did not extend him the same courtesy. And that image of him walking off that set, his shoulders back and his head high, despite everything that had just happened, would become the defining moment of that entire sorry episode. not Denise's accusations, not her self-righteous posturing, but one man's quiet refusal to be diminished by someone else's cruelty. That was the real story of what happened that day on Loose Women. Not a controversial interview or a tough line of questioning, but a betrayal of trust, an abuse of power, and one person's remarkable grace in the face of both.